Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're taking a deep dive into a really fascinating and often misunderstood event in history, the Galileo affair. We've got a ton of sources to dig into, books, articles, even some of Galileo's own writings. And, knowing that you are interested in Catholicism, I think this deep dive is going to be especially thought-provoking for you because, let's be real, that whole science versus religion narrative you usually hear, it's way too simple.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. The popular narrative often just completely misses like all this nuance, about Galileo's life, his relationship with the church. It's not like he was this lone warrior fighting against religious dogma, right? He was a devout Catholic and a brilliant scientist, and those two parts of him weren't, they weren't at odds with each other.
So, where do we even begin to unpack all of this?
Yeah.
I think one of the biggest myths we need to just bust right away is this idea that the church immediately reject, the whole concept of heliocentrism. The idea that the earth revolves around the sun. I mean, Copernicus, the guy who really brought this theory to the forefront, he was a Catholic priest.
Exactly. And at first, Copernicus's work, it didn't cause this huge uproar or anything. It was even used for calendar reform, which, the church was super involved in. The controversy really started, well, it brewed later on. And I think part of that was just because of, the scientific context of the time.
This is where things get really interesting, I think. Okay, so back then, they didn't have the same kind of concrete proof for heliocentrism that we have now. For example, they couldn't directly observe stellar parallax. That's the apparent shift in a star's position when you view it from different points in Earth's orbit. So imagine trying to convince someone that, the Earth is actually moving when you can't, actually see the proof.
It's a really important point. And it makes the church's, hesitation to just fully embrace heliocentrism, well, it makes it a little bit more understandable. It wasn't just blind faith rejecting reason. There were actual scientific questions that needed answers.
So it wasn't this, black and white science versus religion kind of thing?
No, not at all. Actually, the church was a major patron of science back then. A lot of church officials were scholars themselves, involved in astronomy and all sorts of other scientific things. I mean, the Vatican even had its own observatory. It was a much more intertwined relationship than we often think about today.
Wow, okay. This is really making me rethink everything I thought I knew about Galileo.
Mm-hmm.
So if it wasn't just about the science, what else was going on? What else was contributing to his conflict with the church?
Well, personalities and politics definitely played a role. Galileo, he had let's just say a colorful personality.
Yeah.
And he wasn't afraid to ruffle some feathers, even if those feathers belonged to, some pretty powerful people in the church.
Yeah, and I've heard about this infamous book he wrote, Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems. Wasn't that where he kind of mocked the Pope?
He did. One of the characters, Simplicio, he's the one arguing for the Earth-centered view. And most people saw him as a caricature of Pope Urban VIII. And to make things worse, this was all happening during the Counter-Reformation, a time when tensions were really high for the church. So Galileo's actions, they were kind of like poking a hornet's nest.
So we've got scientific debate, you got clashing personalities, and we got this really politically charged atmosphere.
Yeah.
But even with all of that going on, Galileo never renounced his faith, did he?
That's right. And that's something that often gets lost in, how people usually tell this story. He really saw science and religion as these two, complementary ways of understanding God's creation. He even wrote, and I'm just going to quote him here, "The Holy Scriptures and nature proceed alike from the divine word, the former as the dictate of the Holy Spirit, and the latter as the observant executor of God's commands." He genuinely believed that studying the natural world was just another way of getting closer to the divine.
Wow, that's a really beautiful way to put it. It really makes you think, huh? It really challenges that whole idea that faith and science have to be at odds.
It does, doesn't it? And it makes you wonder, if the conflict wasn't about Galileo rejecting his faith, then what actually led to that famous trial in 1633?
That's what I want to know. Let's dig into that next, because I have a feeling there's got to be more to the story here.
Welcome back. As we're picking up our deep dive here, I think it's important to remember we left off with Galileo about to go to trial. And, even with all that was happening, Galileo never wavered in his faith. Even as his work was creating all this tension with the church, he was still a devout Catholic.
Yeah, it's interesting to me how that often gets, overlooked. People just assume that this was a scientist rejecting religion. But Galileo's story is so much more complicated than that.
Exactly. He saw science and religion as like different but ultimately like compatible paths to understanding God's creation. So when we look at the trial, I think it's really important to keep that context in mind.
Okay, so let's get into this trial. What were the specific charges against Galileo?
Well, contrary to what a lot of people think, he wasn't actually convicted of heresy for believing in heliocentrism. The church, their main issue wasn't with the theory itself, but more with how Galileo was, presenting it. Like, he was ordered back in 1616 not to teach heliocentrism as fact without, like, conclusive proof, which at the time was still lacking.
So it was more about him, like, not following orders than anything else.
Yeah, in a way. The church saw themselves as, the interpreter of scripture, and they felt that Galileo was kind of overstepping his bounds. They saw the Bible as the ultimate authority and felt that any scientific ideas, especially ones that seemed to, challenge biblical interpretations, they needed, like, really strong proof before they could be accepted.
Right, right. And I mean, especially considering, this is during the Counter-Reformation, the church was facing all these challenges.
Yeah.
They were probably being extra cautious about anything that could undermine their authority.
Exactly. And you know what's interesting? Even within the church, there were a lot of different opinions about Galileo's work. He actually had some supporters among the clergy, and the Jesuits, who were known for, their scientific work, they were actually pretty receptive to his ideas at first.
So it sounds like things were much more nuanced than just church versus science. There were these internal debates, theological considerations, and of course, all that political pressure. It was all, swirling around this case.
Definitely. And all those factors played a role in how this trial, how it all played out. And another thing we should probably address, that whole idea that Galileo was, like, brutally tortured, it's just not true.
Yeah, that image of him, being tortured, it's like this huge part of pop culture. I think it's really important that we get the facts straight.
Absolutely. While he was definitely pressured, interrogated, there's really no evidence at all that he was actually physically tortured. In the end, he was sentenced to house arrest, which, yeah, it was restrictive, but it wasn't nearly as bad as it could have been. He lived in pretty comfortable conditions. He was allowed to continue his studies and even had visitors.
Huh, okay. So even in his punishment, there was some leniency there. It sounds like the church wasn't trying to, like, totally silence him or get rid of his work.
Yeah, it's a complicated situation for sure. And while we might not agree with their methods today, it's important to understand, what was going on back then, the historical and theological context that they were operating in.
That context is key. It helps us move beyond these simplistic interpretations and really appreciate, how complex this whole thing really was. So with Galileo under house arrest, did his scientific work just stop there?
No, not at all. He actually continued to make some really groundbreaking contributions to science, even while he was under house arrest. In fact, one of his most important works, a treatise called Two New Sciences, was written during this time.
Wait, so even after being, condemned by the church, he was still coming up with these huge scientific ideas. That's pretty remarkable. So tell me about this Two New Sciences. What was so revolutionary about it? It's kind of wild to think that even under house arrest, Galileo was still, like, making these huge advancements in science. So what exactly was in this Two New Sciences? What did he explore in that?
Well, it was all about, like, the principles of motion and mechanics, and it really laid the groundwork for what we know today as classical physics. I mean, it was revolutionary, just full of all these experiments and observations that really, like, challenged how people thought about how objects move and how they interact.
So he was basically, like, shaping the future of science, even while he was, being punished by the church. There's something kind of ironic about that, don't you think?
Yeah, there is. It just shows you that Galileo, I mean, his pursuit of knowledge, you just couldn't stop it. And it challenges that whole idea that the church, just completely shut down scientific progress. Actually, over time, the church started to recognize just how important Galileo's work really was.
Really? That's interesting. How did that happen? Like, did the church ever, actually formally acknowledge Galileo and his work?
It was a slow process, for sure. By the 18th century, they were allowing people to teach heliocentrism. And then in 1822, the church formally said it was okay to publish books that, supported this theory. And get this, in 1992, Pope John Paul II, he actually, like, formally acknowledged that the church had messed up in how they treated Galileo. He even, like, expressed regret for the mistakes that were made back then.
Wow, that's huge. It shows, like, a real willingness to look back at history and, admit when things went wrong. I think it also says a lot about how the relationship between, faith and science has evolved over time.
Exactly. The Galileo affair, I mean, it's definitely a complicated story, and there was definitely some pain there, but ultimately, it helped create a more nuanced understanding of how faith and reason they can actually exist together and even, support each other.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Galileo's life, his work, everything, what would you say is the most important thing to take away from all this, especially for someone who's, interested in Catholicism like our listener?
I think Galileo's story is a really powerful reminder that faith and science, they don't have to be enemies. He was a devout Catholic his entire life, even while he was challenging traditional scientific and theological views. His desire to learn, his willingness to question, to think differently, and his belief in God's creation, it all comes together in this really powerful way. It's a real testament to the fact that faith and reason can exist in harmony.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that, searching for truth, whether it's through the lens of faith or through scientific exploration, it can really lead us to a deeper understanding of ourselves and the universe. And sometimes that journey takes us to some pretty, unexpected places.
I agree. The Galileo affair might have been a rough chapter in the story of science and religion, but it paved the way for us to have a better, more honest and productive conversation about these two really important parts of what it means to be human.
It's been incredible exploring all the ins and outs of Galileo's life and work, his legacy. I feel like we've all learned a lot from this little trip back in time.
I agree. And you know what? It's a story that still speaks to us today. It reminds us to stay curious, to keep asking questions, and to always, keep trying to find that balance between faith and reason as we try to make sense of the world.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Galileo. We hope you enjoyed it and maybe even, learned a thing or two. Until next time.